ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ross, and this is Electronics with a Drink. Today I have a Bacardi Oak with Coke and lime. That is today's drink, Bacardi, Coke, and lime. As you all may know, I've had a hiatus for the last few months due to the fact that we've had a new family member arrive. And I've been working on some new stuff for the Domoticz server and the Raspberry Pi to make it more stable during operation. As you may know, SD cards, and especially micro SD cards, if you've got a lot of read-write tasks that go towards the card, they tend to fail quite well and hard. And what I've done is I've designed new connections to the Raspberry Pi that incorporate SSD hard drives on the USB 2 ports and PoE Plus power injectors for 2.4 amps of 5 volts. So let's go ahead and get to it. So ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and see what kind of modifications we've made to this Raspberry Pi to make it just a little bit better and a little bit more stable. So what I've done here is I've got a PoE splitter. This is a 2.4 amp 5 volt PoE splitter from a PoE Plus switch. And what it does is it feeds the Raspberry Pi as well as the SATA connector through a small connection that I've made on the board and also spliced it. So if you look at the back side of the board, what I've done is I've actually soldered in the 5 volt connections to the micro USB connections. Now the reason why I did this and did not use the pinouts or the GPIO pinouts was because there is no over voltage protection or over amperage protection for the circuits if you plug it into the GPIO ports. So that's why I went ahead and put it directly to where the actual micro USB port is. So on that, I have, of course, the connector for the RJ45 or the 100 megabit connection for the Raspberry Pi, and then here's the USB connector that is also spliced in to the cable that gives it power to the SATA connector. Now this SATA connection I use for connecting an SSD hard drive to, and what I've done is I've gone to Amazon and I've purchased these cheap SSDs from Sunbow. It's a 60 gig hard drive and it works quite well. It's not the fastest thing in the world. When you compare it to some of the Samsung 850 Pro drives, it's very, very slow, but for USB 2 it's perfectly fine. Now if you look on YouTube or if you look into Yahoo or Google or whatever and see how you can boot from a hard drive, as a matter of fact, the raspberrypi.org website also has a good tutorial on how to make it bootable from the hard drives, from the SSD hard drives. What you have to do is you have to have a micro US or a micro SD card that initiates the boot sequence to go to the USB and to boot off of the hard drive. The system works quite well due to the fact that I don't have any external power supplies. It directly connects to the PoE Plus switch, which is connected to a UPS. But on top of that, I did one better and I went ahead and made my own backup power supply. This is a prototype. It basically uses the 18650 battery, and these are small charger slash power output boards for the 18650 batteries. This system right here that has a micro USB port on the actual board itself, and then I've soldered on a male micro USB connector. This will last about 2.5 hours on the Raspberry Pi that I have currently in service, running the Domoticz server. it just works. And I've tried this with other boards. I've got an RK82, 8622, I think this one is. It's a good board, but it's hard to load anything outside of what it currently has in the firmware. And this has an actual onboard M.2 SSD. I've also tried to use the Tinkerboard from Asus, and this also has big problems with trying to install third-party software. It's next to impossible. If there's anybody out there that knows how to do this, please let me know. Put it in the bottom in the comments to how you can actually put, for instance, Ubuntu on it. That would be really useful because the software that's on it is basic, but it doesn't meet the requirements that I need. I don't want a graphic user interface. I just need the command line interface, which is why I've gone and used our standard Raspberry Pi. These things are versatile, and the modifications that I've made on this board have been very useful, and the one that I currently have connected to the system, I haven't had any issues. The only thing that I've had to do once and twice is when I do an update, a sudo apt-get update or upgrade, I've had to reboot the system. But that's common. Nothing runs perfect. I would say I've got 4 9s instead of 5, and cannot complain. We've got over 35 sensors in the house, and runs perfect. So with my trusty helper, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go through the command line interface. I'm going to show you what kind of load we've got running on the Raspberry Pi currently. I've got 2 different setups running on the Raspberry Pi as we speak. So as we look at the Raspberry Pi, we'll go ahead and do a top. And we'll show you that we currently have a couple things running on the Raspberry Pi. The Domoticz is running at the top, and then we've got also a UniFi controller, which I have a total of 5 hotspots in the house. The system itself does not take up much of the processing power. I went ahead and ramped up the processor to 1.2 gigahertz on all 4 cores to make it run efficient and not bog down or bottleneck. So now we're at the web interface for the Domoticz server, and I have all of my systems running without problems. For the last 6 months, I've had no issues with running on the SSD. The only issue, like I've said in the past, is that I've had to update, and when the updates come, usually I have to do a restart. But in most cases, when you look at what I've got running, the only 2 main concerns that I have are the UniFi controller and the actual Domoticz server. But nothing has choked. The web interface is very snappy, it's very clean, it's very quick. Don't have any issues with temperature sensors. If we look at the log, it's constantly updating. And that means that all of the sensors are communicating within the wireless network, and I'm not running into any issues with bottlenecking or dropped packets or CRCs, etc., etc. So what it comes down to is if you plan on using the Raspberry Pi to run your Domoticz server, I recommend you look into the raspberrypi.org website and see how you can boot from an SSD hard drive. In most cases, you don't have to do the modifications that I have done to the Raspberry Pi, but instead you have to put out a power supply that can produce enough power for both the hard drive SATA adapter and the Raspberry Pi. When you do that and you connect it to the network, most of the times you won't have any problems. It's basically the same setup as if I was to use the 2.4 amp 5 volt PoE injector. outside of that, using a big machine, you don't want to do that because it's just power hungry. The main concern is to save as much power as possible, to use as few components as possible, and to make it as efficient as possible, because you don't want to be maintaining the system on a regular basis. So that is the update as of now, since I've been running the Domoticz server on Raspberry Pi for the last 6 to 8 months. No issues. And I want to get a shout out to my friends and colleagues at letscontrolit.com. They have now started a Patreon website to fund their project full-time and to give us a good firmware for the ESP type chips, both the ESP8266 series and the ESP32s. If you would, please go to patreon.com and look them up, and I will have it down in the bottom for anyone that would like to donate to their cause. So that's it from my desk. I hope you all have a good holiday. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. If anybody has any comments, questions, or suggestions, please do post them down at the bottom. I will be more than happy to answer any questions, comments, or suggestions you may have, and possibly do a video on them. I usually answer within 24-48 hours. In the meantime, have a drink and happy holidays.